Episode of the Dawn of Shades. I am your host, Gia Scott, and today is August 4th, 2009, and this is episode 318. Well, another year is drawing to a close and a new one on the brink of beginning in a way. For some reason, harvest ends the year for me rather than winter as it does for most people, and the end of summer means kids return to school to begin their new year, and harvest is nearly here once again. Here in New Orleans, schools will be opening in about 2 weeks, although in other parts of the country, it will wait until next month after Labor Day. With summer drawing to a close, it's a time of reflection, too, of looking back over the summer and how we planted our crops in a symbolic sense, and how they've grown over the summer and whether or not they have borne the fruit we anticipated. I can't help but wonder, too, about our politicians. If we were to look back from their point of view and ask the same questions about things like the economy, their management of the H1N1 flu virus, an upcoming vaccination campaign, about the management of disease outbreaks in various locations around the world, and the other issues that plague our discussions with worries and concerns. I worry anytime the news keeps insisting that something is true that no one can seem to verify, like the wonderful new jobs and the end of the current recession. Well, maybe worry is too strong of a term, as I am the incurable optimist. Anytime something is bothering me, I take the issue and I ask myself, is this something that I can do something about? Or, if not, why am I giving it my attention? And if so, what kind of action can I take to influence this? If I can't influence it, then I have to just let it go and not worry about it. Focusing worry on the what-ifs of life are apt to give them fuel to manifest themselves. So if you are plagued with the negatives in life, perhaps you should examine what you're giving your attention to, about the negative things that you're dwelling on. Unemployed, broke, and worrying about it isn't going to fix it at all if all you can do is think about how you don't have a job or money. Think about what you do have, the support of your family, your friends, your peers, about the good things that you do still have. Then you can think about how you can influence what is missing, like the job and money part. It's not going to make you rich overnight without dwelling on the possibility of job loss and financial disaster continually. Is sure apt to make that manifest overnight. And talking about manifesting, we may be also dealing with other paranormal events when we have this sort of manifesting going on in our lives, and thinking that we're a little bit out there. Paranormal events in our lives are not necessarily unusual. Tonight's guest is the author of a very interesting book called The Secret Life of Genius, How 24 Men and Women Were Touched by Spiritual Worlds. John Chambers is an interesting person in his own right, and I wish for everyone to welcome him to the program. John, would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
I'd be happy to, and thank you for having me. I'm Canadian. I've been here for 32 years, and for quite some time now, along with being a publisher and being a teacher, I've been writing about paranormal phenomena, and I got very interested in what kinds of experiences with the beyond very famous, very successful men and women, people we call geniuses, might have had. It struck me that when ordinary people like you and me tell our friends about our brushes with the paranormal, or what we think may be our brushes with the paranormal, nobody really believes us. They ask us, what do you know? Not anything more than I do. But so it occurred to me, let's find out what sorts of experiences great men and women had. Men and women of such accomplishment, of so much intelligence, as is known by everybody, that we kind of have to take them seriously. It struck me that it might be a good way of shaking the skepticism of many people about psychic experiences, to try to write a book about what experiences of great men and women. So I did that, first of all, with my book that Inner Traditions published in January of last year, Victor Hugo's conversations with the spirit world. The great author of Les Miserables had attended 2.5 years of seances and with his friends, and many of the transcripts were preserved, and I translated and published a lot of them in that first book. And about a month and a half ago, Introductions brought out my second book, which is about the analogous experiences of 24 great men and women. You know, it's often these people didn't say much about their experiences, just let something slip out here and there. But in our century, where everybody's after news and everybody's digging into the past, much more has become known. And so I was surprised and pleased to find that I had a lot to write about, and that these 24 people, and that's by no means all of the great people who had experiences like this. 24 of them had experiences worth writing about, and a number of these experiences are such that everybody really should know about them.
Yeah, you know, I had never really dwelt on whether or not famous people from the past or the present had paranormal experiences. So often, you know, even those of us who have had paranormal experiences ourselves tend to look at news reports of this actor or that actor or this public figure and their paranormal experiences as publicity, hype, or nonsense. You know, we don't give it a lot of credence.
No, we don't.
And yet we give our own experiences credence, and our peers will look at us and will think, oh yeah, she's a little touched.
You know, some of these people that I write about, their achievements are so monumental that you know, it's impossible to think of them in any way as wingnuts or crazies or anything. And you really have to listen to what they say. I ought to add that these people who had these experiences, and in particular the ones who had lengthy experiences, like Victor Hugo or the poet Yeats or the poet James Merrill, never quite knew what to make of these experiences. They were always doubting the nature of what was happening to them. But they had these experiences, and while they never could quite accept them, they also could never, ever dismiss them. And so it's it was fascinating and mesmerizing to read about what these experiences were and to read the channel texts that some of them have produced. And it also gives you pause, because if these towering geniuses could never dismiss these experiences, then who are we to dismiss them at all? We really need to look at them. So that's some of the stuff. That's some of the
yeah. You know, I guess, you know, and it is. It's so hard for the average person to really consider their experiences as being relevant or important. And they do, you know, I know lots of people who think, okay, you know, I saw my grandfather's ghost and, you know, I'm nuts. And, you know, it really doesn't mean that.
Yeah, it's we all have these experiences. I tend to think we should take them a little more seriously. You know, I thought I might mention to your listeners some of the themes that are in the book. It consists of 24 great men and women going up from the past, starting way back in, I think, the year 1500, with the Italian goldsmith Cellini, and then goes up to the present. And I haven't tried to separate out the themes. I haven't tried to categorize, separate out the types of experiences. So I thought it might be interesting for your listeners if I did kind of sort them out and describe a couple of them, if you'd like. And the one that I think might interest your readers the most, and the one that interests me the most, is those experiences that have to do with the year 2012. We're all talking about 2012.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just around the corner now.
That's it.
You know?
That's it. It's just alarmingly close. And so I thought I might say a little bit about what some of the people, some of the great men and women whose lives I describe in this book, had to say about that, or what they might have experienced. And really, we of course only get this with the last four people in the book, the only ones that were born in the 20th century, and they all of them had something to say about 2012. They didn't call it that, though. Let's see. Would you like me to say a bit about that?
Oh, yeah. That's definitely something very, very interesting.
It is. Well, all four of them talk about coming destruction. One of them, Doris Lessing, there's one woman and three men. The woman, Doris Lessing, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I'm going to talk a bit about their qualifications to make any kinds of statements. The first one, Doris Lessing, won the Nobel Prize for Literature for 2007. The second, the Japanese novelist Yukio Mishima, was being highly touted for the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he would have won it had he not committed ritual suicide at the age of 45 in 1970, which was a tremendous loss to the world, really. And the third and fourth persons who wrote about this are Americans. One's the novelist Norman Mailer, who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and the other is the poet James Merrill, who won 1. And I mention this because I think we have to take these people seriously, given their abilities and their accomplishments, when they tell us in their works that humanity is now facing a very rough time, wholesale destruction in the near future, unless we radically change our ways.
So you have to put it out. I mean, really.
Pardon me?
You have to have an out.
Yeah. Well, they do. There is an out. Isn't it? There is an out that is suggested. None of them cite the year 2012, but they all see the time of destruction is coming very soon. And let's see, only one of these four, that's the poet Merrill, had a real sort of knock 'em down and drag it out experience with the paranormal. He, for 35 years, he and his partner David Jackson used an Ouija board, and most of his masterpiece, a 500-page poem called "The Changing Light of Sandover," consists of transcripts or reworkings of these seances. And the other three, I think, only had bare brushes with the paranormal, if any brush at all. We don't know because these people don't say much, and almost by accident would we sometimes discover that they did have these experiences. But they talk a lot. These other three, Doris Lessing and Norman Mailer and Yukio Mishima, they talk a lot about the coming destruction of mankind. Only 2 of them, Lessing and Merrill, only 2 of the 4 suggest that this period of destruction is the kind of prelude. It will be a prelude to man's transcendence to a higher level of reality. I think that's a major theme amongst many people today who are writing about the year 2012. That and how to ensure that we can get there personally. There's only 2 write about it, but in both cases, these authors suggest that it can be a very rocky time, and that not all of mankind will necessarily be translated into some kind of higher density realm. Norman Mailer doesn't talk about any kind of transcendence at all. He has some very weird views, but they're fascinating. They're views that are a little bit in line with the Kabbalah. Mailer asserts in a number of his books that God and the devil have been at war with each other since the beginning of the universe, and Mailer believes that God isn't all-powerful, and that he'll probably lose this battle soon. So what he says makes scintillating reading, and he does not seem to be very optimistic, and he doesn't suggest any kind of transcendence. And the great Japanese novelist Mishima, who killed himself, was an atheist. He was basically a nihilist, and he sees nothing ahead for us but the void, absolute and total destruction. I guess I make him sound like a pretty destructive figure. After all, he killed himself. But he's a very great writer. His novels are supremely well written, and I talk about them in my chapter, and I hope people read them. It's a terrible tragedy.
Well, I tell you what, your description of his ritual suicide is extremely vivid.
I'm glad to hear it. It was a horrible thing. He did it kind of in public at a military headquarters in in Tokyo, and I begin the chapter with it. But he got the attention of the world with it. Many people remember that, and they know about him because of that. So I'm glad it came across. I'm glad I was able to write it as vividly as I did, and it's the most arresting, awful, thought-provoking thing, because this man was a great genius, one of the best writers ever, and he had a family, he had 2 kids, had many friends, and he destroyed himself at the age of 45. So that's quite a story, and beyond that, I hope people read his books. He's fairly well read in this country, but he's very pessimistic about the future. And I also want to mention one more thing to you, that Victor Hugo, in my first book, of course, is about Victor Hugo's experiences on Jersey Island in the English Channel, 2.5 years of participating in seances. And, Hugo's spirits made a prophecy to him about the year 2000, which was astonishing because all this was taking place in 1853, 1854, 1855, a century and a half before the year 2000. And yet they told him, and it's in my book, that in the year 2000, clouds would begin to drift across the face of the earth, and a very bad time would come. So I find that amazing. That prediction was made so long ago. So you can add Victor Hugo to those authors who...
Yeah, because, that's kind of a very accurate description, because it probably did, this period of change that everybody's talking about. It isn't going to start, in the blink of an eye. It's
right.
It was something that's taken some time. And to say that, the year 2000, dark clouds are going to start moving across the face of the earth in a bad way, that's probably a more accurate foretelling than many other things that
I know. I mean, you're pretty close to the date of 9/11, and when you're making a prediction like that from the perspective of the year 1852, and you're just a few years out, that is to say, it's 2000, not 2012. You're pretty close. So that's amazing, and it is very interesting and almost disturbing. It is very disturbing to read what these people have to say. I wanted to mention too that a couple other themes in the book. One is reincarnation. A lot of these writers had experiences revealing to them the existence of, or at least were very fond of writing about reincarnation, and that's a theme in the major works of these 4 writers I already talked about, James Merrill and Doris Lessing and Norman Mailer and Yukio Mishima, these writers who really were writing about 2012. Reincarnation is another theme. It interests those 4. I don't know to what extent they really believe in it, but they certainly find it something very compelling and possible, and they put it in their works of fiction when they're not talking about it outright in non-fiction works. But other, much earlier great persons that I talk about were interested in reincarnation. This Frenchman named Alain Arpine, who lived in the 19th century. He's not well known anymore in France even, and not well known here, but he wrote amazing poems which reincarnation was one of the themes, and he also wrote poems which had to do with societies on Earth before the Sumerians, before any other societies that we know of in our history, great societies. So he was kind of a very, very, very early von Daniken figure, this French poet of the early 19th century. He's interested in reincarnation. And Yeats, of course, was with his great family experience. So I mentioned all that. Your listeners would find that interesting, I think, to hear about all of these very, very accomplished people who believed in this or felt it was well worth their while to write about reincarnation. Another theme is channeling. But that's a theme found in the experiences of many of these people.
Before we go any further with the channeling, would you describe for us what channeling is?
It's taking today there's quite a bit of it, I think. I'm not sure. I'm more interested in what the authors the the great persons I talk about in my book think about it, then, and having an opinion myself, I'm not sure what to think. But people kind of go into mediums go into a trance, and they communicate words from spirits from the beyond. That's channeling. We hear quite a bit about that these days. There are quite a few channeled texts around, and people using a Ouija board, little planchette whips around a board with letters of the alphabet on it and spells out messages. That's channeling, and it's been popular for a long time. In fact, it was all the rage in France in the mid-19th century, and so there's quite a bit about that in my book.
Well, I was wanting to make sure that everybody understood what we were talking about with channeling, because you get some very conflicting sort of descriptions of it. The channeling does involve a trance or an altered state of consciousness, as well as the psychic transmission of information. There's no other way to put it, because it's not like they're given a document and they read it to you, because it's not like that. But it does involve a trance.
Yeah, it does involve an altered state of consciousness. You know, many of the people I write about in my book had these experiences, and they never knew quite what to make of them, but they were unable to dismiss them entirely. I mean, often channel material, you have all kinds of errors, and I don't think anybody should ever take very seriously the predictions that come from spirits when they're channeled. But still, something enormous is going on there, and certainly some of the people I write about in my book, like Victor Hugo and Yeats and Jung, and the psychologist Carl Jung, felt they had to take these things very seriously and try to understand them, and try to understand what were the right circumstances for producing this sort of material, and how it could be studied and how it could be understood. So I do write about that. But I'm not a writer. I'm not a proselytizer. I'm not trying to persuade anybody of the truth or not of any of
Right. No, that just, the description of this is what they said.
Yeah, this was what happened to these men and women, and in many cases they didn't want to say, but it came out, and here it is. And if these geniuses finally didn't know what to make of it, really, who are we to dismiss it out of hand? And so I have some of the material, some of the actual channel material in the book. And in my Victor Hugo book, I have quite a bit of channel material. So it's awfully interesting.
So even in the channel material, you see the 2012 and the reincarnation themes crop up.
Well, they crop up amongst these 24 great men and women. They crop up, and they sure crop up these days. It seems to me there's like hundreds of books on these subjects.
Oh yeah, you type 2012 into Google, and just see what you get.
Right.
Yeah, there's thousands and thousands of websites, talking about it. And sometimes it's everyday people making their own, predictions, prophecies, whatever term you want to choose, about, that particular date.
Well, everybody seems to say something a little bit different, but there's so much about it, and it's very I'm very struck by the fact that some of these big figures from the past also talked about something like this. They didn't call it 2012. They didn't give a specific year, but they did predict. They do seem to suggest that it was communicated to them that these things would happen, not long from today. So those who believe in such things will find some support in what some of the people in my book say. And the same for reincarnation, and the same for channeling.
Yeah, it's not like we can go get a how-to manual or a dictionary for paranormal predictions that gives us,
no.
who's right and who's wrong.
It's impossible to figure it out. It's so complex and so mysterious, finally. But there is something there. There's something important there, I'm sure.
Well, and you must have had a time about choosing which 24 people. Because, for every person that's out there that's legitimate, I'm pretty sure there's a couple that are not. That are making up things for their own personal gain of some sort.
Yeah, I'm sure of that. And there are some people who are just honestly mistaken. They think they're channeling things.
I mean, they're truly deluded for whatever reason that, that what they're saying is true. Sometimes they're the victims of manipulation of other people. There's lots of reasons why they would go there. So how did you choose which 24 people you included?
Well, I searched around. I've been a student of literature, and I looked around. Many years ago, well, not many years ago, maybe 30 years ago, I was writing all kinds of stories on psychic phenomena as a kind of journalist of the paranormal. This was up in Connecticut when we were living in Connecticut. And I found out that, first of all, that this poet named James Merrill had written some books of poetry, all of which were based on his experiences with the spirits via the Ouija board, and one of which, this was looking back to 1977, one of which had just won a Pulitzer Prize in poetry. This book was based on his experiences, and there were all kinds of actual transcripts from the Ouija board seances embedded in the poetry, and also he would summarize what had been said. And I found out that we lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he lived in, where was it? He lived in a tiny town, not far away, maybe 90 miles away. So we decided to go visit him. I called him up and said, I'm very interested in your channeling experiences. I write about paranormal phenomena. Can we come and visit you? And he was extremely gracious, and we drove up there. This very brilliant man, who actually, by the way, he died in 1996, but he was the son of, one son of the Merrill who founded Merrill Lynch. So he came from quite a distinguished family, but his interests could hardly have been more different than those of his father. We went to see him, a very well-educated man who knew all kinds of languages and written all these great books of poetry, but he was the most gracious man in the world. I mean, he didn't care how much you knew or didn't know or anything. So he cooked dinner for us, and then he brought out his Ouija board and started to use it, and we heard his spirit speaking to us, saying the spirits that whose words he's recorded in his books of poetry. So that kind of had a powerful effect on me. I didn't know what to make of it. I was a bit of a skeptic at the time. It had a pretty powerful effect on me, and I said to him, what other poets like yourself or novelists or whatever throughout history have had experiences like this? I said, I've never heard of this before. And he said, Victor Hugo is one. And he went to his library and he pulled out a book, which was a book going back to 1923, and it was the first edition of some of the transcripts of some of the seances that Victor Hugo attended from 1850 to 1854. So this book went back quite a ways. Hugo didn't want anybody to know about this, and the transcripts were not released until after his death. Because Hugo was a politician as well as a writer. He had many enemies. He didn't want people to have a reason to ridicule him. So he thought the world of these experiences, of the words of the spirits, he thought at one point this was a Bible of the future, the new Bible, a new religion was emerging. But he was very busy with other things, and finally he packed all the transcripts away in trunks, and in his will said, 10 years after I die, you can have a look at these and start to publish them. He had some executors of these transcripts. So the first few transcripts appeared in 1923, and James Merrill showed me this book. And I got very interested. I did spend 3 years at the University of Paris. I did know French. And I thought, well, I'll get a hold of these transcripts and translate them and bring out a book. So that got me more and more interested. I did that, finally. In 1998, I owned a publishing company, and I brought out an early version of the Victor Hugo book that Interditions brought out last year. And so in that book, I wrote something about Merrill. I'd already written things about Merrill's experiences, and now I wrote about Hugo's experiences. I translated a good many of these transcripts, maybe 25 or 30, the more important, and the material is fascinating. So then I was getting more and more deeply involved in this kind of thing. I had looked at Merrill and written about him, and I'd looked at Victor Hugo had written about him, and of course, last year I Bennett Editions brought out a second edition of it, much changed with all kinds of things added. And so I set about finding out what other poets and writers had these kinds of experiences. And I found out that the poet Yeats, William Butler Yeats, who also won the Nobel Prize for Literature, had many experiences. A couple of days after he got married, his wife began to do automatic writing. This was on their honeymoon, and this went on for 3 years. All kinds of scripts were produced, and Yeats used a lot of the things the Spirit said as lines for some of his most famous poetry. So this was a gigantic experience. And again, Yeats didn't quite know what to make of it. He couldn't dismiss it. He couldn't quite accept it. And finally, he just decided to use what the Spirit said for his poetry, although he never did dismiss this experience at all. So there was Yeats, and I was able to put Yeats in my Geniuses book that has just come out. And I found out more and more through the years, and I wrote a number of articles for a magazine called Atlantis Rising, which maybe some of your listeners know, great magazine. And there I published articles on Balzac, and I continued to look around in libraries and find out who had had these experiences, and wrote these articles. And finally, I was able to change them, bring them up to date, change them radically, and they make up. Many of them make up this Geniuses book. But there's an awful lot of people who've had these experiences.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book. I mean, let's see. You've got the Italian Goldsmith. You've got Nostradamus, Ben Jonson, Sir Isaac Newton.
Sir Isaac Newton is quite a story in itself, but your listeners might find that very interesting. Very interesting story. Extraordinary. And
tell us a little bit about Sir Isaac Newton and his paranormal experiences then.
About Newton, did you say?
Yes.
Well, sure. Newton, everybody knows that Sir Isaac Newton was, they know who he was, this great scientist who invented modern science, who discovered the law of gravity and developed all the laws of modern physics and mathematics, and laws that are still used by engineers to send spacecraft around the solar system. But it began to become known, I think in the early part of the last century, that Newton hadn't only written about science, that he had also written about theology and biblical studies and many things like that, but that his writings were heretical, and he couldn't afford to have them made public at the time. Even a great, renowned, worshipped scientist like himself couldn't make them known for fear of hurting his career. But he had written all of these heretical things, many more words than his scientific writings, and and had put it in his will. They shouldn't be released, but that they should be kept by his descendants. His descendants consisting of really just one niece, because he never married. But they were kept. But in 1937, the descendants of his niece needed money, so they went into London and they auctioned these religious manuscripts off. I mean, thousands of pages, really, written in Latin and some in Greek and English. And there they were out in the world. People really had hardly heard of them. Even Newton scholars had hardly heard of them. And they got bought and sent to various universities. Some went to a big university in Israel, others went to Yale, and I think a good number of them to Cambridge. And scientists began to, linguists, scientists, historians began to look at them, and they discovered that contrary to the what people had said in the 18th century and the 17th century, namely that Newton had a kind of eccentric side and that these writings really weren't very important, because the contrary to that, these writings were extremely important and extremely interesting, in fact, mesmerizingly interesting, and that Newton considered them to be just as important as his scientific writings. And an awful lot of these, there's something called the Newton Project. This is an online organization that puts online he's putting online all of these manuscripts. just as quickly as they can be translated from Latin to English or tidied up or edited or commented on. And so that's happening, and some of your listeners should go to find the Newton Project on the web. These are amazing documents. They're pretty hard to read because Newton wrote them in the same way that he wrote his scientific books. They read almost like series of theorems or equations. But once you get, and people are beginning to write books about them, and it appears that Newton was extremely upset that his science, the various things that he developed, practical knowledge of the law of gravity, he was very concerned that these ideas might be misused. He was very concerned about the rise of technology, which he foretold. He was very concerned that these ideas would be used in an immoral, unethical, irreligious fashion. And in fact, they were. And they have been. And people use technology based on Newton's findings, based on his great discoveries, to conquer the world. Newton wanted them to be used to help mankind, to make all of us more powerful people. That emerges in these writings. And he did all this enormous research in religious matters to try to come up with something to balance the hard science of the equations of mathematics and physics that he had produced. He really was trying to work toward what he might call some kind of unified feudal theory of all knowledge, in which science was combined with true religion. He did much research in religion to try to find what it had originally been, what the basic ideas were before they became corrupted by various religions. And he was trying to produce something that would cut off at the past what he foresaw as the distortion of his science into technology that could be used by powerful people to brutalize the world. So I'm glad I was able to write something about that in this book. Newton he absolutely didn't believe in paranormal phenomena. He didn't even believe in that our soul went to heaven. He thought it went to sleep. He believed in God, and he was a Christian, but he didn't believe in paranormal phenomena. But he did all kinds of research into something quite different. Not science, not paranormal phenomena, but religion as it must have been. He came to the conclusion that religion had been corrupted here, there, and everywhere in the world. He tried to trace it back. He traced it back to Noah, Noah's Ark. And so my chapter's on all the many things that Newton wrote about Noah. He tried to find out if there really had been a Noah. And actually, at the time, in the 17th century, most people believed that Noah had really existed. There had been a worldwide flood, and that Noah's children, his descendants, had repopulated the world. Sounds ridiculous to us, but Newton believed that. But at any rate, he certainly made an enormous effort to find out what the truth was. And he did that because he wanted to get some notion of what religion was like when it was brought by Noah across, in fact, the basic elemental religion was preserved by Noah in the Ark. Newton calls it the religion of the Prytaneum, and was survived the flood, and Newton wanted to know just what that was. So that's what my chapter is about, and it is the most interesting thing you can imagine. Again, it's not, he was not touched by spiritual world. He was a powerful man who stood alone, who rethought everything, and in these now being discovered, now being interpreted writings, was trying to kind of remake our vision of reality and enhance the science he had produced and create something that might really help the world. So that's that chapter. That was a hard one to write. I've been writing things about Newton for 5 years or so. That was a hard one to write, but it's so interesting. And if anybody buys the book, I do hope they'll read that chapter.
Oh, really. I don't know how they could skip it. I mean, Isaac Newton is a character that appears in our lives when we're in elementary school.
That's right.
And he's with us all through our lives. It's
amazing to think that, when you get to grade 9 or 10 or 11 or whatever, and you start to study physics, everything you learn, Newton invented. These, in grade school, in these complicated courses you take in high school, your time is full enough. You're busy enough understanding these things that are what Newton invented. That's how amazing he was. And it's all the more amazing that at the same time as he was producing all of this, he was producing a whole other set of writings that were meant to place his scientific writings in some kind of ethical context. They were meant to try to prevent his scientific ideas from being misused by the world. And toward the end of his life, he saw that they were going to be misused. So I don't think he died. I mean, most people think he didn't die a very happy man. But he was an amazing person. And, more people should try to get to know these other works. The difficulty is that he was so clever that it's hard to read these works because, as I say, it's almost like you're trying to read a series of equations. But there are many commentaries about these writings on the Newton Project site, and I hope people will have a look and try to figure out what Newton said. And if they come up with some answers, they should publish them. Everybody should get together and try to work this out because he said extremely important things. So that's Newton.
It's interesting that he was trying to find a way to balance his scientific side with the spiritual side.
Yeah, he did do that.
Yeah, and you wonder how many other scientists has that happened to?
Well, I think Einstein has tried to do that a bit, but I wouldn't know. I don't really know anything about Einstein. But you're right; it hardly ever has happened.
And does it have to get ignored?
Pardon me?
Are these scientists having these experiences and refusing to acknowledge them?
Well, I think that a lot of scientists, even great scientists today, sort of don't care. I think that ego plays a big role often, and I mean they're maybe more interested in fame and in what posterity thinks than in making sure that their ideas are used properly. And Newton was interested, did have something of an ego, was interested in what the world would think of him. But also, I mean, his true greatness, I think, lay in the fact that he was able to step outside of these things that he himself had invented, that were newly born from him, step outside them and work with their consequences, not get carried away by the fact that he had done these wonderful things. And indeed, when he wrote these works of science, people were flabbergasted. Other scientists couldn't believe that one man could have written this, could have come up with all of these things. One scientist asked another, does this man, does he eat like other people? Does he sleep? I mean, it was amazing what he did. But at the same time, he was able to work with the consequences of what he had done. But he was totally remarkable. He was really kind of above the normal run of great men. And I think today, many scientists, they get carried away by the fame they acquire from doing these things. And I guess that's pretty understandable. But there are few people as enormous as Newton was. And so not many people today can do what he did, can have that sort of perspective, can put their ego aside. And that's too bad. But I hope, I really do recommend to your listeners that they go to the Newton Project site and tell me what's going on. It's very complex. There should be lots of people sort of having study groups about this, I think. So that's
and there's so many other interesting people, but we are getting close to a break, so I don't want to get off on anything too terribly deep and profound. We've got about 9 minutes, I guess. But, let's see, we've got William Blake. There's just so much.
Maybe your readers, or your listeners, sorry about that, your listeners would be interested in knowing that Jules Verne is in the book. Most people have read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or one or another of his novels, or seen a movie based on his novel. I have Verne in the book, and he's kind of if I can talk about him for a minute, he's kind of a very strange bird. He was incredibly successful. He wrote, I think, 78 novels, and not just 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or Around the World in 80 Days, but 78 novels, and most of them are bestsellers, and they're still selling well. And there's a list somewhere online of the number of translations authors have had. And Jules Verne is second. He's had the second highest number of translations of his works of anybody in history. Agatha Christie comes first, and Shakespeare comes third. So he was incredibly successful, but he also lived this horrible domestic life. He had a very miserable domestic life. He seemed he wasn't very interested in his wife, and he would disappear from home for long periods of time. And some people believe that he actually had a second wife and a second home, although we don't know anything about that. He had one son, Michel, who was just a holy terror from day one, who hated his father, and whom Verne had to send to institutions for a couple of times, for long periods of time. And to top it all off, Verne's nephew, Gaston, shot and tried to kill him when he was 58, and Gaston wounded Verne in the ankle and left him with a limp for the rest of his life. So he had a horrible personal life. I talk about him and also about that and about his wonderful achievements as a writer in the chapter. But Verne is maybe, I don't touch upon this to any extent in the chapter, but maybe he may have been kind of caught up in, he lived in Paris much of his life, and he may have been caught up in some of the more, I don't know how to say it, sleazier and more sinister aspects of the great interest there was at the time in France in channeling and the spirit world and making it kind of being able to activate in yourself what they call the fluid that would enable you to call down the spirits and so on. In Paris towards the end of the 19th century, there were a number of little kind of cells appeared of pretty unsavory characters who were rather brilliant and who wanted to figure out how they could channel energies for their personal benefit and to have power over other people. There's even a famous case of a sort of war between two groups of psychics who tried to kill each other with negative thinking. And there's no evidence at all to suggest anything about Verne's involvement, but his life was so miserable that it's hard not to think that he didn't somehow or another fall into
bad company.
What's that?
Fall into bad company?
Yes, that's it. There's no proof whatsoever, but we don't know anything much about him except he had a terrible time. There were all these negative influences in his life, and maybe he put them up in Paris.
It seems like even, looking back over his life, he had a very secretive life.
He had a very what?
Secretive life.
Yes, he did. Absolutely.
Even from his own family, he was a very secretive person.
Absolutely.
And that leaves lots of room for speculation.
It does. I guess it leaves too much room, doesn't it? Because it's awful easy to say that, if we don't know anything about a person, it's awful easy to say, well, he went to China every night, or you can say anything you want. And that's why I hardly touch upon this in the chapter. But he was a powerful man. He was a genius, really. And you have to wonder just why it was that things were so miserable for him. And he did live in Paris as a youth at the time where there was tremendous interest in these things. At the same time, Victor Hugo, out on the English Channel, was becoming very involved with the spirit world through table tapping. You have to wonder if Verne didn't have some kind of involvement that nobody knows anything about. I mean, when he was about 28, he lived on a street which was right by a house where some very famous seances took place. The seances were attended by a famous French astronomer named Camille Flammarion. So, anyway, that's something for readers of the book to think about, and I scarcely touch upon it in the chapter, but I just talk about the misery of his life, but also the wonderful quality of many of his books. So
I can't help but wonder, why did his nephew try to shoot him?
Nobody knows. Nobody knows. The Verne family didn't press charges, but they had the nephew, who was quite brilliant and with whom Verne had been pretty close. They had him sent off to an institution, I think in Belgium, in the next country, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. Died about 1936. He died about 50 years later. It's a great mystery, and it's really kind of an awful thing. Verne never recovered. He never could walk properly for the rest of his life. So there's a strange case of, there's a sort of case of negative involvement with the spirit world. I think. Nobody knows. But as you say, he was very secretive. Nobody knows what really happened.
Yeah, the secretiveness, he was a brilliant novelist.
Yeah.
He's considered sort of one of the fathers of science fiction.
Right. Oh, he was amazing.
Yeah, the father of time travel.
Right.
And all sorts of things. And, he dreamed up concepts that were so far from common knowledge.
Right.
You can't help but question, okay, what was he doing with all that time he was away from his family?
I don't know. He went on cruises with his friends, with other guys, and for a while people thought that perhaps he was gay. That was the secret. But no, I mean, apparently, researchers are pretty certain now that he wasn't. That wasn't what was going on at all. But it's sort of like he could never grow up. But it must have been more than that, because he seemed to have gotten so many people angry at him.
Yeah. And what his novels weren't things that would inspire anger that I can see.
Yeah.
So where did the anger actually originate from?
It's very amazing. It's quite a story.
Yeah, it is. Again, Jules Verne is somebody that most of us read by junior high. We've had our first encounter with one of his books.
Oh, he's great fun.
And maybe they're less popular now than when I was a child. But
they're still very popular, Gia. They're still very popular. I mean, he'll be read forever.
We've got such amazing things that have come down the pike since then.
Yeah.
Maybe Jules Verne had lost his magic in a sense.
Yeah.
But
I also have a chapter in my book about H.G. Wells, the so-called founder of science fiction.
H.G. Wells for the second half, because guess what?
Okay.
It's time for our break.
Okay.
So folks, do please stay tuned to the Dawn of Shade. And while we're away from your computer, check out our website, www.exogenynetwork.com. We've got a bunch of stuff about John Chambers up there tonight. And the Dawn of Shades will be right back with more John Chambers. Welcome back to the Dawn of Shades. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and once again, I'd like to remind everyone to visit the website, www.exogenynetwork.com. You can sign up for the newsletter, wander around and explore the website. Let me know what you think of it. There are links to take you to blogs, Twitter, and even Facebook. If you have a question that you wish to have asked, you can email it to me at giascott@gmail.com. I'm monitoring an email during the program with John Chambers tonight, and I'll try real hard not to miss a thing. You can also, if you've joined us in the virtual auditorium in Palo Alto, you can send a question to me in text, and once again, I'll pass it on to John. And so, John, what were we talking about? But before we get going anywhere, please...
We were talking about just about everything. I think I'd mentioned H.G. Wells when the conversation ended. He's in the book.
And hang on to that thought. Before we start talking and forget all about it, would you give the information about your book, where to get it, and your website one more time?
It was published about a month and a half ago by Inner-Traditions, and it's available just about anywhere. You can order it from Inner-Traditions directly, or you can get it from Amazon.com, or you can order it through any bookstore. So it's I don't know if it's on display in bookstores at this point, but it's very readily available.
Okay, so H.G. Wells, is one of the ones we were just mentioning before break.
Yeah.
He's somebody that everybody has heard about.
That's right.
And, definitely a very popular writer. So, what was his paranormal experience?
Well, I'm not sure if he had one, but there is reason to believe that he had an enormous one. This is the 19th century when they all, like Jules Verne, for example, are pretty close-mouthed. They don't say much about these experiences. But, you know, H.G. Wells, when he was about 23, was an assistant schoolmaster for a short time at a school in Wales, and he was playing football with the students, a bunch of the students, and he got hit very hard and fell down and could hardly get up and staggered off home and was terribly ill and kind of vomited all night and lost consciousness and really couldn't remember anything that happened for a while. So finally a doctor came, and he was told that he had almost died, and his kidney had been ruptured, and because of that, Wells was really not in the best of health for all the rest of his life, and that was like another 60 years. And, you know, of course, he doesn't tell us that he had a near-death experience or anything like that, but one of the very remarkable things about this man, who was amazing at predicting the future, was that he wrote some short stories, and one in particular which seemed to describe a near-death experience. There's one in particular called The Door in the Wall, and the protagonist goes through this door in a wall, and then he encounters all of these things that people who have near-death experiences encounter today. But the thing is that we have the descriptions of near-death experiences that we have only because medical science has advanced so much that we're able to resuscitate people who've been theoretically dead for half an hour sometimes. And so we have these amazing near-death experiences which last for a long time and have all kinds of components. Wells, in his short story, describes what sounds like a near-death experience, but it's like a description that we would have today, a description that nobody could have then, because medical science was such that, you couldn't be dead very long. Nobody could save you, nobody could keep you alive, and so on. So it's kind of remarkable that he had that experience. And you have to think that perhaps something extraordinary happened to him at some point, because he was so prophetic about the future. He got so many things right. He predicted the Second World War, and he predicted Hitler, he predicted the A-bomb. It was like truly amazing, and he was a genius, certainly, and he was very studied, but you have to wonder whether there wasn't yet another factor. So that's what I talk about in that chapter, and there's again no proof that he had a near-death experience, but it's fun to speculate about it, and it's fun to look closely at these short stories, I think. So that's Wells.
Yeah, well, so often, even when you're looking for events in relatively recent history in your own family, that things are presented in a sideways manner. Nobody says, I saw a ghost or I was talked to by spirits. It might be presented as, I had a dream.
Yeah, that's
or
right.
Someone said, or...
People don't like to say. They don't want people to think they're crazy.
Right. So, they do. They're presented in a sideways manner, and so for an author to present it as a piece of fiction is a very safe way to do so.
Well, he may have done that. I mean, there's no proof that he did that at all. But, it's possible.
Yeah. And so, let's see. Well, going back through your book, which I've got right here in my hot little hand, you have, 24 people. That's a lot of people to talk about. You've got Madame Helena Blavatsky, Mistress of Hidden Wisdom. Okay, why was she special?
Well, she founded a movement called Theosophy. She created Theosophy. She founded the Theosophical Society. She was a Russian woman, traveled all around the world when she was very young, knew all kinds of languages, and had all manner of psychic experiences, and accumulated an awful lot of interesting information about psychic experiences and hidden knowledge and secret societies and civilization before our civilization. And she put this information together in a couple of books. One, The Secret Doctrine was the name of one. It was about 1,200 pages long. And we're talking about this was happening toward the end of the 19th century. And the other one was called Isis Unveiled, I believe. And people who helped her with her books thought that she channeled them, thought that they were somehow communicated to her from other realms of reality. And so there was she had this extraordinary personality, and the books are sort of these extraordinary great piles of nuggets about every aspect of New Age lore, really. She attracted a lot of attention with these books. She was truly interested in kind of getting beyond dry science into some sort of mix of science and spirituality, like Newton was, but I don't think Newton would have given Madame Blavatsky the time of day. But she was truly interested in these things, and her books they're huge and fascinating. And she went on to found the Theosophical Society, which I don't know if it's very big now, but it was very big for a long time. And it attempted to sort of combine spirituality and science and produce a more rational kind of religion that yet was mystical, that yet was nourished by the ability to penetrate higher realms of reality, and not in a rational way. So she was sure interesting, and one always hears a lot about her. She was quite a sort of public phenomenon. Everybody knew about her, and there were all kinds of stories about her, especially her past. She'd been a trapeze artist and this and that and the other thing, but finally she possessed an enormous amount of knowledge, a lot of it suspect, and a lot of it not suspect, and her books are huge, but they're worth reading, named Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. So she is very interesting. She's really very interesting. And she deserves a lot of study.
And then you have the chapter on Thomas Mann. It was not possible, but it happened.
Right.
It's an intriguing title in itself.
Yeah. Well, your listeners might be interested in reading that. It's a little hard to describe that one. He went to seance. Mann was a sort of a skeptic. He won a Nobel Prize for Literature. I think it was in 1929. None of these people were, you have to take them all quite seriously. And a friend persuaded him to go along to a seance in Munich, and some very strange and eerie and inexplicable things happened there. And ever afterwards, Mann could not be a skeptic anymore. He couldn't quite accept what he'd seen, but he couldn't reject what he'd seen. And in fact, he was so influenced by this experience of one evening that he placed in his novel, The Magic Mountain, which I think is considered to be his greatest novel, which he thought it was his greatest novel. He inserted in that some scenes about scenes of seances based on his experiences at the seance in Munich. So I have to ask your listeners to read that. It's impossible to describe what happened. I mean, the title is "It Was Impossible, But I Saw It," and so they can say what they think. He had the most extraordinary experience.
And of course, another one we got to touch on is Harry Houdini.
Oh, Houdini, yes. Is he? I think he's still well known, isn't he, in the United States? I think he is.
Yeah. I mean, everybody. Houdini probably comes up in daily conversation. People may not remember the man so much, but as any escape artist is referred to as a Houdini.
Right. He's kind of created. He's a concept, isn't he? Sort of now.
Yeah. Well, because he was just so well known for that he has. Somebody would say, "Oh, that dog's a Houdini," or "My 2-year-old's a Houdini."
Right. Well, so he's known, and he, of course, was a supremely great escape artist. I guess the best ever. And but he was very, very, seemingly very against mediums, and he spent a lot of his life going around and unmasking phony mediums. Nobody was quite sure why he did this. They wondered if he did it for the publicity. Some people thought he did it because he was angry as could be that no medium could help him to contact his dead mother, whom he had worshipped. So some thought he was unmasking all this mediums because he was so incredibly angry at mediums for not being able to do that thing and help him talk to his mother. Nobody quite knew. But a few years before he died, he said to his wife, "Look, if I'll prove the existence or non-existence of a spirit world in this way. If I die and discover there is a spirit world, I'll communicate with you, and you should offer an award to the person, to the medium who can pick up what I say. And so he died. He died of just a freak accident. He was very young, 55 perhaps. And this was the most lamentable thing. He was deeply mourned. He was a wonderful, wonderful performer, and a kind of great guy too. And but some mediums came forward, and there was a series of seances, and something was communicated. And there's been a big controversy ever since about did Houdini really speak? Has he proven? Did he prove that there is a spirit world, or if it wasn't his words that were channeled through these mediums, then should we consider that to be proof that there is no spirit world? Because if Houdini, if the great escape artist Houdini couldn't escape from the spirit world in the form of communicating with our world, then nobody could, and there's no spirit world maybe. So that's that one, and again, that's a complicated thing. The content, it's very, very interesting what happened at the seances that took place after he died. The strange messages did come through. They were very strange, but there were all sorts of unsavory characters appeared, and was there fraud, and was there this, and was there that? That's a fascinating story. That'll always be a fascinating story.
Yeah. And then, let's see, Winston Churchill. He's another well-known character.
Oh, my goodness. He's the greatest ever. I mean, he's the one historian whom I quote in the chapter said, maybe Churchill did something that most historians think is possible. Maybe he changed the course of history, and of course, I mean, he defeated Hitler, really. But when he was very young, he fought in the Boer War. He was about 25, maybe. He was a journalist and also a soldier. He way down in in South Africa, the tip of the world, and fought, and he got taken a prisoner of war by the Boers, and he escaped. And he made it back, but he made it back because of something very, very strange and wonderful that happened to him in the course of the escape. I'll leave it to your readers to read that, your listeners to read that. If I describe that, I'd have to tell the whole story. I'd have to read the chapter. That's a complicated one, but it's a wonderful story about him. And few know that he had this experience, and if he hadn't had it, maybe we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here.
Yeah, Winston Churchill is an important character in Western history. So without him, our whole experience of life today
the world would be different.
Dramatically different.
The world would be different. And so I say to myself, well, if there is spirit intervention, if divine forces reach down sometimes to save somebody, then they would certainly do it for Churchill, because here was a guy who had to survive to do what he did. So that's awfully interesting, really. Yeah. I'm a great admirer of his.
Well, yeah, Churchill was one of the important characters that emerged from World War II.
Yeah.
And without him playing a part, our history today might be very, very different, and our reality today might be very, very different.
I think we might.
And that leads us up to Carl Jung.
Jung. Yeah, that's an extraordinary.
And there's a passage in there that you were going to read for our audience.
Well, I will. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to put the phone down while I get my copy, okay? 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting chapter about Carl Jung. He's an interesting character. For those of you who are not familiar with him.
I'm back. I call this chapter Speaker for the Dead, and I think everybody's heard of Carl Jung. Of course, he's the great 20th century psychologist who invented terms like archetype and the animus. Very great man. And I begin this chapter with something that Jung recounted in his autobiography toward the end of his life. It wasn't very well known, but just let me read it as the chapter begins, okay? This is chapter 19 in my book. Carl G. Jung, 41 years old and already a well-known psychiatrist, was more apprehensive than usual on this sunny afternoon in the summer of 1916. His house was filling up with the spirits of the dead. It had started the day before, when his eldest daughter glimpsed a white figure flitting across the room. Then, independently, his youngest daughter had her blanket snatched away from her twice during the night. Also, his 9-year-old son had an anxiety dream that same night. An ominous atmosphere seemed to flow all around him today as he walked through the house. It was as though the air were filled with ghosts. At 5 p.m., the front doorbell rang frantically. Everybody looked to see who it was, but nobody was there. Jung, who was sitting near the doorbell, not only heard it ring, but also saw it moving. And many years later, Jung, now one of the great thinkers of the Western world, wrote in his autobiography, and here I quote, "We all simply stared at one another. The atmosphere was thick, believe me. Then I knew that something had to happen. The whole house was filled as if there were a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deep right up to the door, and the air was so thick it was scarcely possible to breathe. As for myself, I was all a-quiver with the question, for God's sake, what in the world is this? Then the spirits cried out in a chorus, 'We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought.'" End of quote. Who were these spirits? What did they want? Why Jerusalem? Tremulously, fearfully, Jung put these questions to the uninvited guests. Answers came. The answers were as astonishing as they were alarming. Jung had more questions. There were more answers. Jung would wrestle all his life with what he learned that night. The setting of this uncanny encounter was Jung's house in Zurich, Switzerland. This ghostly visitation was the culmination of an event that had been building toward critical mass for several months. Jung had been ill for 3 years, caught in an emotional crisis that rendered his mental health precarious. His wife had allowed Toni Wolff, who would be Jung's mistress for nearly 30 years, to become a member of the household because Toni was the only person who could calm Jung down. The symptoms had first come on in late 1913, when the psychiatrist, Jung, along with having visions of eminent persons from the past, had experienced a recurring dream of a new ice age that destroyed all living things. He had come to believe that he was the vessel of a higher power that granted him visions of the future. This quote-unquote creative illness, as he called it, which Jung saw as menacing him with a psychosis, became so intense that he was forced to withdraw from teaching at the university. Many of his colleagues feared for his sanity. Jung found he could not even read scientific literature. Then, on this crisis day in 1916, the spirits came in numbers. They told Jung that what they had sought in Jerusalem were answers to questions like, what is the nature of man? What is the nature of the universe? Who is God? Is God dead? What Jung learned that night was hardly reassuring. It shattered any sense of complacency he might have had about what happens to us after we die. The spirits told Jung that the dead know nothing beyond what they knew at the moment of death. The young psychiatrist Jung was completely taken aback. As he later wrote, quote, "According to the traditional views, the dead are the possessors of great knowledge. People have the idea that the dead know far more than we, for Christian doctrine preaches that in the hereafter we shall see, quote, face to face, unquote." But apparently, Jung now thought, we do not see face to face. He continues in his book, hence the endeavor of the spirits to penetrate into life, and hence this is the cause of the endeavor of the spirits to penetrate into life. They do so in order to share in the knowledge of men. I frequently have the feeling that they are standing directly behind us, waiting to hear what answer we will give to them and what answers to destiny. That evening, it's the same day, now as the spirits first arrived, that evening Jung suddenly took up a pen and began to write an essay he would later call Septem Sermones ad Mortuis, that's 7 sermons for the dead. It seemed to him that he was not writing the essay himself, but that it was being channeled through him from a Gnostic priest named Basilides, who lived in Alexandria in the 2nd century A.D. Jung recalled in his autobiography many years later that the text, quote, "began to flow out of me, and in the course of 3 evenings the thing was written," unquote. The spirits didn't wait for him to finish. Quote, "As soon as I took up the pen, the whole ghastly assemblage evaporated. The room quieted and the atmosphere cleared. The haunting was over." End of quote. Reflecting on all this many years later, Jung wrote in his autobiography, quote, "From that time on, the dead have become ever more distinct to me as the voices of the unanswered, unresolved, and unredeemed. For since the questions and demands which my destiny required me to answer did not come to me from outside, they must have come from the inner world. These conversations with the dead formed a kind of prelude to what I had to communicate to the world about the unconscious, a kind of pattern of order and interpretation of its general contents. End of quote. And that's the experiences I related in the first part of this chapter.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you can put many, many different interpretations on it.
Yes.
And that's really up to the reader to decide that. But, it shaped the way that he regarded the human psyche.
Yeah. This experience certainly helped him to understand many things and to create new knowledge.
And that's been true all the way through with your, the people that you wrote about, is that their experiences did seem to shape how they regarded the world around them.
For all of these people, yes, I think so. Absolutely.
Now, the sole living person is Doris Lessing. So we cannot leave her out.
Doris Lessing. Do you know her works at all? Do you?
No, I'm not familiar with her at all.
Oh, I don't. She just won the Nobel Prize, but she's almost 90. She's been around for a long time. Still, I don't know how well known she is. She was born in southern Rhodesia and been living in London since she was about 30. So she's really a British writer, but she's a very wonderful writer. She's written, I think her works amount to 60 volumes. But beginning about, maybe 1980, she wrote a series of 5 science fiction novels, really. She called them, she didn't want to call them science fiction, she called them space fiction. And the series has one title. The title is Canopus and Argos, Archives. And the 4 books are made to seem like the archives, the records of the 2 races of aliens that have put mankind on Earth, and that have continued to help mankind and push him forward by virtue of bioengineering and all manner of things. That's quite a theme. So one of the books is narrated. The 2 alien races are the Sirians, a race from a planet revolving around the star Sirius, and the Sirians and the Canopians, from a planet revolving around the star Canopus, which we don't see much here. It's almost in the southern hemisphere. And these 2 species, these 2 races of aliens, have empires, and they have agreed to. They're fairly benign empires, and the 2 alien races have agreed to share Earth. So they're responsible for bringing Earth along, and that's what our progress under the direction of these 2 races is. What our book is about, what the 5 books are about, and she is very sort of subtle and wise, and the books are just fascinating to read. They're really all about these alien races and how they manage to hold their empire together and to keep various species on various planets moving forward, and it's really quite moving. I mean, she was able to portray these extraterrestrials as quite benign and wise.
Huh?
She doesn't think a whole lot about. She doesn't think much of Homo sapiens. She thinks that we make things more difficult for our masters, who are really benign guides, than we should. But I really, the books are fascinating because she portrays so beautifully the extraterrestrials. I never have seen in all of science fiction and so much of the literature we have today that's supposedly channeled from aliens. Never seen such sensitive and touching and complex portrayals of extraterrestrials. So I would sure recommend the books on that account. Lessing, we don't really know what experiences, what brushes with the spiritual world Lessing might have had. Maybe some, because she got very involved with Sufism at one point, very involved in sort of trying to expand and break the bounds of her being through the meditative practices of Sufism. And it may be that she experienced far more than she has told anybody. One of her novels, the heroine, who's a kind of alter ego for Doris Lessing, has very strange experiences and seems to leave this plane of reality temporarily anyway. And it may be that Lessing, that these books are fiction. She calls them space fiction. They're like science fiction, but maybe that they're not entirely fiction. We don't know. We have no reason to suppose that they're not just space fiction, but much of these books sound a lot like some of the books ostensibly channeled from aliens these days, and I don't think many of these channels know the work of Lessing. I really recommend her. She's the most wonderful writer, and she's still producing. I think she wrote her last novel last year. I think she's decided to quit. She got so much attention of winning the Nobel Prize that she lost her concentration, and she feels she can't write novels anymore. And she is almost 90. She's not in good health, but boy, she's quite wonderful.
And she's just proof that you don't have to lose cognitive function with advancing age.
No, you don't. I don't think she has, but I just think it's. I think she's probably finished. She's wrote 60 or work covers 60 volumes, and maybe she said everything she wants to say, and she's not very optimistic about things either. She is one of that group of 4 writers, 4 great men and women at the end of my book, the only ones born in the 20th century, who really they don't lack for a love of life or joyousness or anything like that, except perhaps Yuko Mishima, but they're not. They're very, very pessimistic, and
it's interesting that they are, because as far as the psychics and whatnot that I've had on and that have told us about 2012, they've been universally optimistic.
Well, are they really? I'm not too familiar. I'm familiar with some of those books, not all of them. They are they? Well,
it's not that they've written a book. These are just people that I've had on the program.
Yeah.
They may have written a book, but not about that particular topic. And when it would come up in conversation, they seem to be universally optimistic about mankind's chances on saving the situation, finding our out.
Really?
It makes you question, are they being excessively optimistic?
Nobody likes to have to contemplate these things. Great writers generally, one of the reasons they're great is they do look things right in the face. And here we're talking about great writers. Maybe I should. My book is not going to make anybody feel very comfortable. What a lot of these great men and women have seen and what they write about is not anything that encourages any sort of complacency. And I don't like to. My book makes me uncomfortable. It made all these things made.
Maybe when I say optimistic, maybe I'm sort of misleading people. They didn't say it was going to be without difficulty.
Yeah,
well, pain.
Yeah, I don't know, but all I know is that these. My book, as it turns out, was not going to make anybody very comfortable, except that it's always wonderful to see what the human spirit can create in terms of these books and these ideas and these visions. That's wonderful. But, Victor Hugo, I have a chapter, I have my book on Victor Hugo, and one of the chapters in this book is on Victor Hugo's channeling experiences with the spirit world. And in that chapter, I translate a few stanzas of a poem that Victor Hugo wrote at the time that these seances were taking place. A poem that he called "What the Shadow's Mouth Says," And in that poem, Hugo tells us that the spirits told him that our planet Earth was a prison world. Nobody's going to enjoy reading that, but maybe you recall, or maybe you listeners recall, from the first Star Wars movie, the scum of the galaxy scene where Han Solo and I think Chewie, his animal sidekick, have a kind of rendezvous with some desperate figure in a bar. I think the bar is orbiting a planet far, far away from Earth. And this bar is full of every type of horrible person, ex-convicts and dope addicts and serial murderers. And this is the famous scum of the galaxy scene. With everybody in there they're from all kinds of different planets. It's the famous scum of the galaxy scene. And these spirits suggested to Hugo that our planet was the scum of the galaxy. I guess nobody's going to want to hear that. And Hugo did write this poem and talks about, he believed in reincarnation, and he believed, and the spirits told him that everything on Earth had a soul. All men and women had souls, and all animals had souls, and all plants had souls, and even all rocks had souls. But they also told him that these souls, like our souls, were the reincarnated souls of beings who had committed great crimes all across the universe in their previous lives. And that's not a very pleasant philosophy. So that underlies the poem that he read. And in that poem, which I do have in the book, it's a huge poem. I have some stanzas. And it talks he talks about how our planet consists of these souls that have fallen from other parts of the universe and taken rebirth in rocks and rocks and trees and so on. And it's almost horrifying, and it's certainly, it's not going to make anybody feel very good at all. But Hugo wanted to say it, and Hugo believed it. So that's in the book. That's in the book.
Explain why sometimes humans can be so positively rotten and no good, as the saying goes.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah.
Why we possess not only the ability to be so great, but to be so small.
Well, do you think he's being small with that poem? Oh, you mean people in general?
No, people in general.
Yeah, sure. But the critics, the French critics of Victor Hugo, academic professors and so on, they find this poem so uncomfortable that one critic, who was also a doctor, I believe, a medical doctor, wrote a book in which he said that he had diagnosed Hugo, and that Hugo was suffering from schizophrenia at the time he wrote this poem. I mean, this man simply couldn't stand the thought that Hugo was sane. This great genius was sane when he wrote this poem. So he brought out a book in which he said he wasn't sane. I'm a doctor, and I'll tell you that he was suffering from schizophrenia. Now, whatever one might think of the poem, you could say, well, maybe Hugo had a terrible time of total bitterness or something. Whatever you might think of the poem, Hugo was certainly not insane, because, some years later he completed Les Miserables. Les Miserables, which everybody knows is this very, very sane book. It's about 1,200 pages long. It's a real masterpiece, and it's very sane. It has very clear moral values. Hugo has a very excellent grasp of modern society and its faults and so on. And so you can't have a guy being schizophrenic and then 10, 12 years later coming out with a novel like this. You have to be fantastically super sane to go out with a novel like this. So I just say that suggests that, what he says in this poem sure doesn't make anybody feel comfortable, and it wasn't intended to make anybody feel comfortable. And it was basically dictated by these same spirits who were able to say 150 years ago that in the year 2000, dark clouds would swim across the face of the earth. So these spirits, they have come here to Jersey Island, in English Channel, where Hugo is. They've come to, maybe their words have come through garble. We don't know how clear it is. We don't know how we understand. But they have come to make some pretty serious statements and to try to get us moving. That's what emerges from what these people say. It's fascinating, really. But these experiences, they're very uplifting in the sense that these are great visions these people had. Many of these people I write about in this book, but they're great visions. They're beautiful, but also they are alarming. They make you realize. They make you see that you really should be getting up and going out and fighting like crazy to get the world better again. So, not for the faint-hearted, these guys.
Well, whether or not people who are listening tonight, whether or not you believe that spirits exist, this is fascinating reading. I have some friends that are extreme skeptics, and as far as they're concerned, nothing spiritual can possibly exist.
Well,
and, whether you think that way or not, this book is going to make you think.
Well, it should, I mean, these guys, these people, these great people, the great men and women, didn't necessarily want these things to happen to them, and they never knew quite what to make of them. But a lot of things are on record. We do know what happened, and I've tried in this book to present the material as objectively as possible. I don't, I pull back from making any kind of judgment, and I don't know myself. But the fact is that these amazing and unnerving and great things happen to these people, and there is something of a record, something of a public record. I try to put a lot of that into this book, and people should read it. And people should know about these things, and then they can decide. All these geniuses are just having bad days, or not. But I think people should know.
And when I've read in the book, I haven't seen no sign that you're doing any interpretation whatsoever.
Well, I try to pull back from that,
The only judgment sort of thing you did was of who you included and who you didn't.
Well, if these guys themselves couldn't come to any kind of conclusion about what was happening, who am I to try to?
I think this book's going to be a great read, simply because it's got the information, and it's not interpreting it. It's just there.
Yeah, I really try to present the material objectively.
Yeah, so I do like the way you've written the book. I haven't finished it, but The Secret Life of Genius, How 24 Great Men and Women Were Touched by Spiritual Worlds, by John Chambers. We're getting down to the wire now on time.
Mm-hmm.
You want to tell everybody about your website and whatnot again?
Well, my website is www.newpara, that's one word, NEWPARA.com/John Chambers, my name, no space there, JOHNCHAMBERS.HTM. But I think you have it on your website. You put my website on your website, which looks great. That looks great.
We transferred most of your page right over there. So
that's fine with me. I had a quick look. It looked like lots of fun. But the thing is that all I do on my website is just present a lot of reviews and material about the books. But the thing is, people want copies. They need to contact my publisher, Intertraditions, Bear, or is available through any bookstore. You can order it, and I guess the easiest way of all is Amazon.com. But there is my website, which does it has a whole lot of reviews and descriptions of the books.
And it's a great website. Hence, that's why most of the guys just moved to a page about John Chambers on Exaggerating Network. Yeah,
that's fine.
Yeah, it was a project for the webmaster for sure.
Looks like it.
Yeah, but it is. It's a great book, folks. So, The Secret Life of Genius, How 24 Great Men and Women Were Touched by Spiritual Worlds, by John Chambers. Amazon, I'm sure Barnes & Noble has it.
Yeah, Amazon.com, and you can. I don't know what bookstores, if any, have it on display, because there's so many books that come out. But you can order it through any bookstore.
Okay. Well, folks, we've run out of time once again. I want to thank John Chambers for joining us tonight and being such a fantastic guest. I have enjoyed the program tonight. I hope all of you have too, as well as having found that it provided plenty of food for thought and more illumination for your personal journey towards truth. Join us again next week as we bring you another fascinating episode of The Dawn of Shades. With that, we are out of time. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and good night.